Welcome to another episode of China's Chances and Dreams of Becoming World Power, a Mission Impossible. The Demographic Time Bomb. How China's past policies threaten its future dreams. For more videos, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share our channel. On Life Fact Daily. For more than 3 decades, the United States has stood alone at the summit of global power. After the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, the world entered what many political scientists call the unipolar moment. Washington was no longer balanced by another great empire. The Cold War had ended, the USSR had collapsed, and the United States emerged as the single, unrivaled superpower. It was a historic anomaly. For centuries before that, the world had always been multipolar. Power was scattered across great civilizations. The Ottomans, the British, the Qing dynasty, the French, the Russian Empire, the Spanish, the Portuguese, the Dutch. No one nation held complete dominance. Yet after the Cold War, the United States had no true rival. It controlled the global financial system, the most powerful military in history, and a vast web of alliances stretching from Europe to Asia. But history never stays frozen. The question haunting the 21st century is whether this era of U.S. supremacy is coming to an end. And if so, who will take America's place at the top, or at least share that seat of power? For years, many analysts have pointed to one candidate: China. China's meteoric rise over the last 40 years has stunned the world. In 1978, the country was still emerging from the disastrous effects of Mao Zedong's Cultural Revolution and Great Leap Forward. Tens of millions had died from famine and political purges. The economy was largely rural, poor, and isolated from global trade. Fast forward to the 21st century, and China had transformed into the world's second-largest economy. Cities like Shanghai, Shenzhen, and Beijing rose into glittering symbols of modernity. China became the factory of the world, exporting everything from cheap toys to high-tech electronics. Its companies began challenging American giants, its navy expanded rapidly, and its global influence spread to Africa, Latin America, and beyond. Inevitably, people began to ask, is China destined to replace the United States as the world superpower? This is more than just a casual question. It's the defining geopolitical debate of our era. Because if China does succeed, it won't just mean a shift in trade or technology. It will reshape the global order itself, the rules, institutions, and values that govern international relations. And here's where the terminology matters. Political scientists describe global power distribution in terms of poles. Unipolarity means there is one dominant superpower. Since the 1990s, that's been the United States. It has unmatched military reach, controls the world's reserve currency, and leads most global institutions. Bipolarity means 2 superpowers dominate, balancing against each other. The Cold War was a classic bipolar era, the US versus the Soviet Union. Multipolarity means several great powers share influence. This was the case for much of history. Europe in the 19th century, for example, when Britain, France, Prussia, Austria, and Russia jockeyed for influence. So what world are we heading into now? China's leaders, particularly Xi Jinping, speak often of a multipolar world. They reject the idea of a new Cold War with the US. Instead, they argue for a global system where many powers, China, the US, Russia, the European Union, India, Brazil, and others share influence. In Beijing's view, multipolarity would weaken America's dominance and allow China to shape the rules of global governance. But in Washington, this vision raises alarms. Many American strategists believe China doesn't simply want equality, it wants supremacy. They see Beijing's calls for multipolarity as cover for building a new international system, one that reflects authoritarian values rather than democratic ones. This is why the Washington Post recently warned, China's new world order is taking shape. To U.S. policymakers, that wasn't a hopeful statement, it was a warning. Xi Jinping often presents his country as a peaceful rising power. He talks about a community with a shared future for humankind. He invokes cooperation, mutual respect, and multipolarity. But many in the West don't believe it. They remember the brutal lessons of the 20th century, when authoritarian regimes promised peace but delivered war and oppression. Mao Zedong, Joseph Stalin, Adolf Hitler. As the New York Times reported in 2023, American officials fear China is trying to create an international order in its illiberal image. An order where censorship is normal, surveillance is universal, and dissent is crushed. And yet, others argue that no matter what Beijing wants, it may never achieve it. The reason? A challenge buried deep within China's demographic structure. This is where the story takes a dramatic turn. Because while the United States and China spar over trade, technology, and military power, an invisible crisis is quietly unfolding inside China itself. One that could undermine its dreams of global leadership. The issue is population. For centuries, China's massive population was its greatest strength. It provided endless labor, a huge domestic market, and the manpower needed to fuel industrial growth. With 1.45 billion people, China has been the most populous nation on Earth, slightly ahead of India. But now, that advantage is turning into a liability. Birth rates are falling. Deaths are rising. For the first time in decades, China's population has begun to shrink. By 2050, experts predict it could decline to 1.31 billion. By 2100, some forecasts say it could fall to just 800 million. That may sound like a lot, but for a nation built on the foundation of sheer numbers, it's a dangerous trend. An aging society means fewer workers, more retirees, and a crushing burden on the younger generation. Think about it this way. In 2020, China had about 3.7 working-age people for every retiree. By 2045, that ratio could fall to just 1.6 workers per retiree, who will build the factories, run the hospitals, and pay the taxes when the population pyramid collapses. This looming demographic time bomb could change everything, not just for China, but for the world economy. To understand how China got here, we have to revisit one of the most controversial policies in modern history, the one-child policy. Introduced in the late 1970s and enforced nationwide in the early 1980s, it was meant to control population growth. Couples were restricted to one child. The government offered incentives for compliance, better jobs, financial benefits, but punished violators with fines, job loss, and sometimes even forced abortions and sterilizations. The policy worked. Birth rates plummeted. But over time, the unintended consequences piled up. The population aged rapidly. Families shrank. Millions of men grew up without siblings, cousins, or extended family. And because male children were culturally favored, China now has a gender imbalance. Far more men than women. Today, the country faces an ironic crisis. After decades of restricting births, it is now begging families to have more children. Propaganda posters once said, "One child is best." Today, new slogans proclaim, "Two are good, three are better." But many Chinese citizens simply refuse. They say life is too expensive, work is too grueling, and the cost of raising children is unbearable. As one frustrated citizen wrote online, "It's not the absence of a three-child policy that stops us from having kids. It's the fact we can't afford them." This is the paradox China faces. It is rising in wealth, power, and influence. Yet it is shrinking in population, aging faster than almost any other major country. Some scholars argue this demographic crisis alone will prevent China from ever surpassing the United States. Others say it will destabilize society, creating unrest among the millions of young men who can't find wives, or among overworked youth crushed by the burden of caring for parents and grandparents. So while many ask whether China can replace America as the next superpower, others whisper a different question. What if China's population crisis makes that dream impossible? And this is just the beginning, because the deeper we dig, the more we discover how demographics, economics, and geopolitics intertwine in ways most people don't see. The world may think the future belongs to China, but the numbers tell a darker story. For decades, the one-child policy was hailed by Chinese leaders as one of the most successful social engineering projects in human history. They boasted that it prevented 400 million births and kept China from becoming overpopulated, impoverished, and unstable. But what was once considered a triumph has now revealed itself as a curse. The policy did not simply reduce population growth. It warped society in ways that continue to reverberate through every corner of Chinese life: economics, politics, culture, and even national security. One of the most obvious and troubling consequences of the one-child policy was the gender imbalance. In traditional Chinese culture, sons were favored over daughters because sons carried on the family name, inherited land, and were expected to provide for parents in old age. When families were told they could only have one child, many chose to ensure that child was a boy. This led to a surge in sex-selective abortions, female infanticide, and abandonment of baby girls. By the early 2000s, China's sex ratio at birth had become one of the most skewed in the world. Normally, about 105 boys are born for every 100 girls. In China, the ratio soared as high as 120 boys for every 100 girls. This imbalance created what demographers call the bare branches phenomenon: millions of men who will never find wives. Today, China has roughly 30 million more men than women of marriageable age. That's more than the entire population of Australia. The social consequences are enormous. These men face loneliness, frustration, and often poverty. Studies show that regions with high numbers of unmarried men also experience higher rates of crime, violence, and human trafficking. Women, meanwhile, are under growing pressure, viewed as scarce resources in a marriage market where their value is measured not just in love, but in family assets. The gender imbalance is not just a personal tragedy for millions of men and women. It's a national vulnerability. Some security analysts argue that a surplus of restless, unmarried men could fuel instability, protests, or even aggressive nationalism. The Chinese Communist Party knows this, and it worries. The second, and perhaps even more devastating, consequence of the one-child policy is the rapid aging of China's population. In 1980, only about 5% of China's population was over the age of 65. By 2020, that figure had doubled to more than 12%. By 2050, it is projected to reach nearly 30%. That means almost 1 in 3 Chinese citizens will be elderly within the next generation. This aging wave threatens to overwhelm China's healthcare system, pensions, and workforce. Imagine the social pyramid. For centuries, it was broad at the bottom, with many young people supporting fewer elders. Today, the pyramid is inverting. A shrinking base of young workers must support a swelling top of retirees. Chinese netizens call this the 4-2-1 problem. 1 working-age adult supporting 2 parents and 4 grandparents. For many young people, this burden feels unbearable. In fact, it has given rise to a cultural movement known as Tang Ping, or lying flat. Frustrated youth reject the endless grind of long working hours, low wages, and pressure to marry and have children. They simply opt out. They live modestly, refuse overtime, and abandon the rat race. This quiet rebellion highlights the deep disillusionment among China's younger generation. Instead of carrying the nation to global supremacy, many are burning out before they begin. China's economic miracle of the past 40 years was fueled by cheap labor and rapid urbanization. Hundreds of millions of rural workers migrated to cities, filling factories that produced goods for the entire world. But what happens when the labor pool dries up? Already, manufacturers report shortages of workers, especially in coastal regions. Wages are rising, eroding China's competitiveness as the world's factory. Companies like Apple are shifting some production to Vietnam, India, and Mexico. Economists warn that China is at risk of hitting the middle-income trap, a stage where countries grow rapidly for a few decades, but then stagnate because they can no longer rely on cheap labor or copycat industries. Without innovation, productivity, and a steady workforce, growth slows, wages stagnate, and social tensions rise. For China, this trap is even more dangerous because it may arrive just as the population shrinks and ages. Instead of becoming a rich nation before it grows old, China risks growing old before it grows rich. Demography isn't just about numbers, it's about culture. In China, marriage rates have plummeted to historic lows. In 2013, about 13 million couples got married. By 2022, that number had fallen by more than 50%. Why? Young people cite multiple reasons. The crushing cost of housing in cities, long working hours in a hyper-competitive economy, the burden of supporting aging parents, gender imbalances that distort the dating market, a cultural shift where women are increasingly independent and unwilling to marry down. The government has responded with propaganda campaigns, matchmaking events, and even financial incentives for newlyweds. But so far, nothing has reversed the trend. Marriage rates are not just a cultural issue, they're a demographic one. In China, children are overwhelmingly born within marriage. If fewer people marry, fewer children are born, and the population decline accelerates. In 2015, China finally ended the one-child policy, replacing it with a two-child policy. In 2021, it expanded to a three-child policy. The government even rolled out incentives, tax breaks, subsidies, extended maternity leave, but the results were underwhelming. Birth rates continue to fall. In 2016, there was a brief spike in births, but by 2020 the number had dropped to its lowest level since the Great Leap Forward famine of the 1960s. In 2022, China recorded fewer than 10 million births, while more than 10.4 million people died. For the first time in 6 decades, the population shrank. Why didn't the new policies work? Because the problem isn't just laws. It's economics and culture. Couples say raising a child in modern China is too expensive. Education costs are staggering. Housing is unaffordable. And the brutal 996 work culture, 9 a.m. to 9 p.m., 6 days a week, leaves little time for family life. In short, the government can allow 3 children, but parents feel they can barely afford one. China's demographic decline doesn't just affect Beijing. It affects the world. For decades, global supply chains have relied on China's massive workforce. Cheap Chinese labor kept consumer prices low in the West. But if China's labor pool shrinks, costs rise worldwide. Investment patterns may shift. Multinational corporations are already diversifying to India, Southeast Asia, and Latin America. Global markets are watching closely. A slowing China means weaker demand for commodities like oil, copper, and steel, hurting exporters from Brazil to Nigeria. Meanwhile, geopolitical strategies shift too. A China facing demographic decline may act unpredictably. Some argue it will become more cautious, fearing instability at home. Others fear the opposite, that Beijing, sensing its window of power closing, might take risks abroad, especially in Taiwan or the South China Sea. In Washington, many policymakers assume demographics will doom China's dream of supremacy. They believe an aging, shrinking society cannot sustain the growth, innovation, or military power needed to overtake the United States. But in Beijing, the story is told differently. Chinese officials acknowledge the demographic challenge, but argue that technology, automation, and state planning can overcome it. They point to advances in robotics, AI, and biotech as ways to offset labor shortages. They claim China's vast scale still gives it unmatched advantages. Who is right? The truth is complicated. Demographics shape destiny, but they do not dictate it entirely. What matters is how societies adapt. So here we are, a nation rising, but also shrinking. A superpower in waiting, but also a society burdened by its own past choices. China's population problem is not just a number. It's a mirror reflecting deeper questions about governance, economics, and identity. Will the demographic time bomb quietly defuse, allowing China to stabilize and rise? Or will it explode, dragging the country into stagnation, unrest, or even collapse? And most importantly, how will this battle over demographics shape the balance of power between the United States and China in the coming decades? Because as we move into part 3, we'll uncover a startling truth. Demographics don't just decide who works and who retires. They shape armies, economies, and global strategy. And the U.S. China rivalry may hinge not on missiles or trade wars, but on something far older and simpler: the number of people alive to fight, to build, and to dream. For centuries, the fate of nations has been shaped by more than armies, wealth, or ideology. Beneath the surface, often unnoticed, lies the quiet force of demographics. Populations grow and shrink, societies age and renew, and with them rise and fall the empires that shape human history. The United States emerged as a superpower not only because of its military might or economic genius, but because it was blessed with favorable demographics. Waves of immigrants brought energy and innovation. A relatively young population powered industrial expansion and technological revolutions. By the time the Soviet Union collapsed, America's demographic and economic foundations positioned it to dominate the unipolar world. China's story is different. It is a civilization thousands of years old, with a cultural memory stretching back to emperors, dynasties, and golden ages of science and philosophy. Its rise over the past 4 decades was nothing short of breathtaking. A country once crippled by famine and poverty surged into the ranks of global powers. Yet within this triumph lurked a contradiction. The very policies that lifted China from chaos also planted the seeds of its current crisis. The one-child policy, intended to ensure prosperity, created an aging society, a gender imbalance, and a looming labor shortage. Now, the dragon that soared is weighed down by chains of its own making. The question remains, can China still reshape the world order? Many believe yes. China's economic heft, its control over global supply chains, and its ambitions under Xi Jinping still give it enormous leverage. The Belt and Road Initiative has tied dozens of countries into Beijing's orbit through infrastructure projects and loans. Its military modernization, especially in the South China Sea and space technology, is undeniable. But others are less convinced. They argue that demographics are destiny, and China's destiny may not be to rise higher, but to plateau and decline. Without enough young workers, innovation will slow. Without enough women, social stability will fray. Without enough taxpayers, welfare systems will crack. This does not mean America is guaranteed victory. The U.S. faces its own demographic challenges: falling birth rates, political polarization, and immigration debates. Europe, too, is aging rapidly. Japan has been grappling with demographic decline for decades. In fact, much of the developed world shares these struggles. But relative power matters. If the United States can maintain a steady, youthful population, partly through immigration, it may retain the dynamism needed to counterbalance China's slowdown. Beyond numbers and statistics, there's also psychology. China's leaders fear that time is not on their side. They know the window for achieving national rejuvenation may close within a few decades. Some analysts believe this creates pressure for risky moves, particularly regarding Taiwan. If Beijing thinks it must act before demographics weaken its hand, it may gamble on conflict sooner rather than later. America, meanwhile, is haunted by the specter of decline. Its unipolar moment is over, and Washington must adjust to a world where its power is contested. The fear of being overtaken by China shapes its policies on trade, technology, and alliances. In truth, both nations wrestle with insecurity, one fearing collapse from within, the other fearing replacement from without. History teaches us that no empire lasts forever. Rome fell, the Ottomans declined, the British Empire crumbled. All once seemed invincible. The common thread? Demographics. When populations stagnate, when armies can no longer recruit, when economies cannot replenish their labor force, decline follows. Sometimes it takes centuries, sometimes only decades. China's leaders know this. America's strategists know it too. The race between them is not just about GDP, missiles, or AI. It is about who can sustain the most vital resource of all: people. Behind the charts and forecasts are real people. The young Chinese worker too tired to dream of a family. The aging farmer left behind in the countryside. The single man in a village with no hope of marriage. The American student burdened with debt, wondering what future awaits in a fractured democracy. These individuals will shape the destinies of nations far more than the speeches of politicians. A declining birth rate is not just a number. It is a generation lost before it even begins. An aging society is not just a pyramid. It is millions of stories of struggle, sacrifice, and change. So where does this leave us? The 21st century is not yet written. China may falter, or it may adapt. The United States may endure, or it may stumble. India, Africa, and other rising regions may shift the balance in unexpected ways. But one truth is clear. Demographics will be the silent battlefield of the future. Armies may clash, economies may boom and bust, but beneath it all, the rhythm of births and deaths will decide who leads and who follows. For now, America and China remain locked in a rivalry that will define the age. But perhaps the real question is not which nation will dominate, but whether any nation can dominate at all. A multipolar world may not be a choice. It may be the inevitable outcome of demographic decline everywhere. And so, the world watches. Will the dragon rise or stumble? Will the eagle soar or fall? Or will both discover that the age of unipolar empires is over, replaced not by another single superpower, but by a fractured, fragile balance of many? The answer lies not in the halls of power, but in the cradles of the next generation. For in the end, the future of geopolitics may rest in something profoundly simple: whether people choose to have children, and whether societies can give them the hope and stability to do so. The story of America and China is not finished. It is still being written, not in treaties or battles, but in schools, hospitals, and homes. The fate of the century depends on it. As we close this chapter, remember, the greatest empires are not only built by armies and economies, but by people. And it is the people who will decide what comes next. And that decision is happening now, quietly, in the lives of billions, shaping the world that will emerge when the dust of rivalry finally settles. For more video like this, subscribe, like, and share our channel. Life Fact Daily.